Now, the argument for socialism is, imagine if all of that ingenuity, all of those resources were, rather than being directed towards making money for a small number of people, were directed towards making all of our lives better, right? So, having technological innovation that aimed at freeing us from the drudgery of horrifying work and actually allowed us to all share in the fruits of something like automation, having investment in socialized, collectivized forms of care that allow us to support one another, having a sustainable approach to our relationship with the environment based on our stewardship of our collective resources and a much more sustainable relationship with the planet. All of these things are not possible under capitalism, because under capitalism, there is one single imperative, which is maximize profit. It doesn't matter if you destroy the planet, you destroy other people. It is all about making sure that you maximize profit. So that is basically the argument for socialism, is that's irrational. It's irrational, and it really denies us what it means to be human, because we're turned into these machines for just capital accumulation. Whereas actually, that isn't what it means to be a human being. That isn't what human life is about. And Marx's famous thing is, we could be fishermen and poets and whatever else we wanted to be, if we all had control over our labor and we had our time back, and we didn't have to focus on just day-to-day survival. I think that's the promise of socialism. It's very difficult to convince people, though, living under these conditions where we're told all the time that if you don't work as hard as you possibly can, you'll be dead, and that there isn't enough to go around. So we all have to compete with each other. In a society like that, it's very difficult to believe that things could be different and that actually, there is enough. And yet today, when you see the huge disparities of wealth that exist between different sections of the population. I know there's a stat, I can't exactly remember off the top of my head, but it's like Jeff Bezos could afford to give a huge bonus. I can't remember how much it was. It was something like, maybe $5,000 or $10,000, I'm not sure, to every single Amazon worker, and still be as rich as he was before the pandemic. Like, the scale of wealth at the very, very top of our economy is basically incomprehensible to the human brain. It's like that parable of putting wheat on a chessboard. There was, I don't know if you remember this. This is, there's a king, and someone comes up to him and basically kind of asks how he could repay the king, and the king says, put a grain of rice onto each square on the chessboard and double it every time. And so he says, oh, okay, fine, that's not very much rice. But of course, when you're doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling, you get an extortionate, extreme exponential increase in the amount that you have. And our brains just aren't wired to understand those kinds of scales of disparity between, where we are and where the people at the very, very top are. I think there's a good stat, which is like, to count to 1 million would take you 12 days, to count to 1 billion would take you 32 years. And there are multi-billionaires at the top of our economy. So that's where the resources are. If we had collective ownership and democratic control of those resources, we could facilitate not only a kind of good standard of living for everyone on the planet, we could actually use those resources to direct innovation in such a way that we could, eliminate poverty. We could tackle global warming. We could travel the universe. We could do all these things that we can't currently do because those resources are all concentrated in a small number of hands and used just purely for profit maximization. So that's the kind of, long-term picture. I think in my book, I look at ways that we can kind of change the system now to get closer to that ideal. So to get closer to the ideal of a society in which our resources are shared collectively and democratically governed. And so one thing I have in there is, the idea of like a people's kind of investment fund, which is basically somewhere where, there's a collective assets of, a nation or a community that's put into a pot and then invested in various different industries. And slowly that pot gains an ownership stake in lots of different sections of the economy by buying shares in businesses, by buying bits of land, etc. And in doing so, you get to a position where everyone starts to own a chunk of everything. And if you have that fund being governed democratically, you can then say to those companies in which you have an ownership stake, you've got to treat your workers properly. You need to stop kind of degrading the environment. That's one of the ideas. You know, some of the like even very simple things that we could be doing to make our economy more socialized now would be things like investing in what's called kind of decommodifying the means of subsistence. So basically taking the things that we need to survive outside of the market mechanism, so providing social housing very cheap for everyone, so everyone can afford it, having things like a national food service, a national care service, free transport, everything that you need to survive and live, you know, just to have a basic standard of living would be free, right? That just, again, frees up your potential. You don't have to focus on just surviving all the time. You're actually thinking, right, well, you know, what do I really want to do with my life? What is in me that needs to be expressed that makes me who I am? So yeah, I'm not going to go through all of the ideas because there's loads and loads and loads and loads. And in my latest book, I talk a lot more about the kind of Green New Deal and why it's so important to be thinking about that in the wake of the pandemic. I think the broad kind of argument is basically that, you know, we can live in a more rational and a more human society than the one that we live in now.
Keep the red flag flying here.